Welcome to RevengeGate. Let's jump into today's story from New York. The scorching Manhattan summer sun beat down on the gray concrete slabs, creating a stifling atmosphere that felt almost suffocating as I struggled to push a heavy wheelchair. My name is Joanna, a 30-year-old custom tailor from Brooklyn who has spent years prioritizing everyone else's needs above my own modest dreams. Today was supposed to be the most decisive morning of my life because I was heading to a high-stakes inheritance meeting that would determine my entire future. However, when I saw an elderly man named Edgar stranded in his wheelchair amidst the chaotic mud and dangerous open trenches of a massive construction site, I simply could not look away. Despite my frantic schedule and the importance of the legal battle awaiting me, my conscience refused to let me abandon a vulnerable soul in such a perilous situation. Edgar looked at me with genuine wonder, his voice trembling slightly as he questioned why a well-dressed young woman would risk ruining her professional attire just to assist a stranger. I admitted that while this meeting was critical, humanity outweighed any financial gain, which prompted a mysterious yet comforting smile to spread across his weathered face. "Are you also heading to the inheritance meeting at the Flynn law firm?" I asked in disbelief after he revealed our shared destination. "What a strange coincidence, so let us go together because I will not let you face those cold-hearted people alone." As we stood before the towering glass facade of the law office, a sudden sense of profound peace washed over me, anchored by the unshakable strength I felt emanating from this fragile old man. Before we dive into how this chance encounter turned my sister's world upside down, please support our channel by liking this video and subscribing right now. I also want to hear from you, so leave your name and city in the comments while typing the word present, because I love knowing where my global audience is listening from today. Only 2 days after the final handful of earth was poured over the grave of Dad, the peaceful atmosphere of our old family home was torn apart by naked greed. My sister Martha did not shed a single tear during the entire process, but instead spent every waking hour obsessively rummaging through cabinets to find the master list of our family's most valuable assets. While I was still trying to process the immense grief of losing my last remaining parent, Martha was already calculating the market value of the antique jewelry and the Manhattan penthouse. She approached me in the kitchen while slamming a thick stack of forged invoices onto the marble countertop with a cold and calculating look in her eyes. "Joanna, you need to sign these documents immediately because the funeral costs and our parents' outstanding medical debts have completely exhausted the estate's liquidity," Martha declared, with a voice that carried no warmth or sympathy. I stared at the papers in disbelief as I realized she was attempting to trick me into signing away my legal ownership of the only home I had ever known. A heated argument erupted when Martha began to insult me for wasting 6 years of my life as a struggling tailor instead of earning a real salary like she did at her hedge fund. She paced around the living room while claiming that my manual labor was worth nothing compared to the financial contributions she had supposedly made to the household over the years. I stood my ground and reminded her that I was the one who directly changed Mom's bandages and stayed awake for countless nights, caring for her during those final agonizing months of her illness. While I was sacrificing my youth and my career to provide comfort to our parents, Martha had barely managed to send a single text message or make a 5-minute phone call to check on their condition. "You were just a glorified maid who lived here for free while I was out in the real world building a legacy for this family." Martha spat at me with a level of venom that made my blood run cold. The situation escalated quickly when Martha grabbed my vintage sewing machine and began shoving my few belongings into tattered suitcases with a frantic and hateful energy. She dragged my things toward the door while screaming that I no longer had any right to occupy a single square inch of this expensive real estate now that our parents were gone. In a display of utter heartlessness, Martha threw my luggage out into the dimly lit hallway of the apartment building, just as a heavy summer rain began to lash against the windows. Consider yourself officially evicted from this family, Joanna, because I will not allow a penniless seamstress to ruin the prestige of my new residence, she shouted before slamming the heavy oak door in my face. I stood alone in the hallway while the sound of the deadbolt clicking into place echoed like a gunshot in the silent corridor. Shaking with a mixture of rage and sorrow, I struggled to move my soaked suitcases toward the elevator while trying to figure out where I would spend the night. Just as I reached the lobby, my phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number that turned out to be Martha's aggressive lawyer, Flynn. His voice was professional, yet entirely devoid of any human emotion, as he informed me that the inheritance meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning would be the final step in making my homelessness permanent and legally binding. Flynn warned me that any attempt to contest the fraudulent debts would result in a defamation lawsuit that would ensure I never worked in this city again. I realized then that my own sister had been planning this ambush for months, waiting for the exact moment our parents passed away to strike her final blow. The weight of her betrayal felt heavier than the suitcases I was dragging through the rain toward the nearest subway station. I knew that tomorrow's meeting was no longer just about money, but about surviving the total destruction of my dignity at the hands of my own flesh and blood. At exactly 7 o'clock in the morning, the sharp blare of my alarm clock echoed through the cramped space of my small tailor shop in Brooklyn, where I had been forced to sleep on a makeshift bed of fabric scraps. My back ached from the uneven surface of the floor, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the heavy knot of anxiety tightening in my chest as I prepared for the meeting. I spent the first hour carefully pressing my only formal navy blue dress with a heavy steam iron, desperately hoping that this small act of grooming would preserve my final shred of dignity before facing the wealthy and arrogant Martha. As the steam rose from the fabric, I realized that appearing professional was my only defense against the inevitable insults my sister would hurl at my low economic status. Just as I was finishing my preparations, my best friend Becca arrived at the shop carrying 2 cups of steaming hot coffee and a bag of fresh bagels to sustain me through the ordeal. Joanna, you have spent your entire life being the backbone of this family, so please do not let that woman intimidate you into giving up what you rightfully deserve, Becca said while handing me the coffee with a supportive squeeze of my hand. Her presence provided a much-needed shield against the cold reality of my situation because I felt so isolated after being cast out of my childhood home. We sat amidst the rolls of silk and cotton while she listened to my fears about the fraudulent documents that Martha and Flynn had likely prepared to strip me of my heritage. Just as I felt a moment of peace, my phone buzzed on the cutting table with a notification that made my heart drop instantly. Martha had sent a vicious text message stating that, if I dared to show up at the prestigious Manhattan law firm looking like a pathetic unemployed failure, she would ensure that I was humiliated in front of every partner in the building. Remember your place as a lowly seamstress, and do not embarrass my social standing with your presence today. The message read with a cruelty that felt like a physical blow to my stomach. Becca looked at the screen and shook her head in disgust while reminding me that Martha's wealth could never buy the kind of integrity I possessed. I quickly gathered my legal documents into a worn leather folder and hurried toward the subway station, but my luck took another turn for the worse when I discovered that the entire L train line was suspended due to a major power failure. With time slipping away and the heat of the New York summer already rising, I had no choice but to start running toward the bus terminal more than 10 blocks away. My sweat began to ruin my carefully ironed dress, while the humid air made my hair frizz and stick to my neck, creating the exact disheveled appearance Martha had mocked. My feet throbbed in my modest heels as I dodged frantic commuters and tourists on the bustling sidewalks of the city. As I rounded a corner near a noisy construction site, I suddenly spotted an elderly man in a worn wheelchair struggling near a deep crack in the uneven sidewalk. This stranger looked completely helpless as he desperately tried to maneuver his heavy wheels out of a dangerous crevice, while several people hurried past him without offering even a glance of assistance. His face was flushed with exertion, and he looked remarkably fragile against the backdrop of the massive steel beams and jackhammers surrounding the dusty street. I did not know who he was, but the sight of his trembling hands reminded me so much of Dad in his final days that I instinctively dropped my folder to rush toward him. "Please stay still for a moment, sir, and let me help you before you accidentally tip over into that open trench," I shouted, while rushing to grab the handles of his chair. The old man looked up at me with eyes that were clouded with a mixture of exhaustion and profound relief as I used all my strength to lift the front wheels out of the sidewalk trap. "You are clearly in a desperate hurry, young lady, so why are you stopping to help a stranger who has nothing to offer you in return?" The man who later introduced himself as Edgar asked, with a raspy voice that sounded surprisingly steady despite his physical predicament. I wiped a bead of sweat from my forehead and told him that my father had taught me that helping those in need was far more important than any appointment, even one as critical as the legal battle awaiting me. 15 minutes later, I summoned every ounce of my remaining physical strength to lift both Edgar and his heavy metallic wheelchair up the steep steps of the last city bus heading toward the legal district. The interior of the vehicle was stifling and overcrowded with morning commuters who seemed entirely indifferent to the struggle of an elderly man trying to find a stable place to rest. I navigated through the sea of frustrated faces to secure the most accessible seating area for Edgar, while I stood firmly beside him, gripping the overhead handrail with shoulders that throbbed from sheer exhaustion. Every time the bus jolted forward or braked suddenly in the heavy Manhattan traffic, I had to use my body as a human shield to prevent his wheelchair from sliding across the grimy floor. Edgar looked up at me with a soft expression of gratitude in his weary eyes as he realized I was prioritizing his safety over my own comfort. The air was thick with the scent of rain-dampened clothes and old exhaust fumes, but the quiet dignity emanating from my new companion made the unpleasant environment feel surprisingly bearable. He began to speak in a low, resonant voice that somehow managed to cut through the loud rumble of the diesel engine and the chatter of the other passengers. Edgar started sharing detailed stories about the many years he had spent serving a prominent family that sounded remarkably similar to my own history with my parents and the home I had just lost. He spoke with such intimate knowledge about the varying temperaments of children within wealthy households, describing how some were born with hearts of gold, while others allowed greed to rot their souls from the inside out. I did not recognize his true identity at all, but I felt a profound sense of emotional connection as he mentioned beautiful, warm memories of a man who reminded me exactly of my father in his prime. "Your father sounds like he was a man of exceptional character, who believed that a person's worth was measured by their kindness rather than their bank balance," Edgar remarked while observing my tearful reaction to his nostalgic descriptions. I found it incredibly strange that this stranger could articulate the exact values that my parents had instilled in me before Martha decided to erase their legacy with her corporate ruthlessness. His words acted as a soothing balm for my wounded spirit because they reminded me that I was not alone in cherishing the humble life I had built as a tailor. Edgar noticed the persistent cloud of anxiety in my eyes and reached out to pat my hand with a firm, reassuring touch that felt like the protection of a guardian. "Do not let the darkness of others extinguish your light, Joanna, because people with benevolent hearts always deserve and receive protection from unseen forces in their darkest hours," he stated with a conviction that made me wonder if he knew more about my predicament than he was letting on. I took a deep breath and finally admitted to Edgar that I was absolutely terrified of the sharp, predatory intellect of Martha and her cunning lawyer Flynn. I explained that I lacked the financial resources to hire a professional defense team to contest the mountain of fraudulent documents they had undoubtedly prepared to render me homeless. Flynn is known for being a shark who thrives on intimidation, and Martha has always been the favored daughter who gets exactly what she wants through sheer force of will, I whispered, while clutching my worn leather folder to my chest. Edgar listened with a terrifyingly calm focus, his grip on his cane tightening slightly, as I described the systematic way my sister had dismantled our family bonds for a piece of real estate. Justice is a living thing that often hides in the most unexpected places, so you must keep your head high when you walk into that office today. Edgar replied while looking directly into my eyes with a gaze that felt as sharp as a judge's gavel. With only 15 minutes remaining before the meeting was scheduled to begin, Edgar and I entered the gleaming glass lobby of the towering skyscraper located in the heart of extravagant Manhattan. The polished marble floors reflected the bright overhead lights, while the sheer scale of the architecture seemed designed to make ordinary people feel insignificant and small. I immediately noticed that Edgar looked somewhat dehydrated from our journey through the heat, so I used some of my last remaining dollars to purchase a cold bottle of mineral water from a nearby kiosk. I knelt beside his wheelchair and used my only clean silk handkerchief to carefully wipe away the streaks of dried mud that had splattered onto his worn cotton sleeves during our struggle near the construction site. It was important to me that he felt respected even in this intimidating environment where luxury and power seemed to be the only currencies that mattered to anyone. Edgar watched my movements with a quiet, observant intensity, while a small smile of appreciation flickered across his weathered face as he took a refreshing sip of the water. The serene moment was shattered by the rhythmic, aggressive clicking of high heels against the hard stone floor as Martha appeared from the elevator bank, dressed in a $1,000 designer suit that screamed of Wall Street success. She moved with a practiced arrogance that forced other people to step out of her path, while a cloud of expensive cloying perfume announced her presence long before she actually reached us. When Martha's eyes finally landed on me, standing next to a man in a battered wheelchair, she let out a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed uncomfortably throughout the high-ceilinged lobby. "Joanna, I explicitly warned you not to embarrass me today, but here you are standing next to a disheveled old beggar as if you are trying to win an award for the most pathetic person in New York." Martha sneered while her eyes traveled over my sweat-stained dress with visible disgust. She looked at Edgar as if he were a stain on the pristine marble while her body language radiated a sense of superiority that made my stomach churn with a mixture of anger and deep-seated shame. Standing right beside Martha was Flynn, who kept checking his gold wristwatch with an expression of profound impatience and annoyance at being forced to share a public space with people he clearly considered inferior. He adjusted his silk tie and looked down his nose at my worn leather folder, making it obvious that he viewed this entire inheritance meeting as a mere formality before crushing my remaining hopes. Martha stepped even closer to us, her face contorting into a mask of cruelty as she reached out and snatched the bottle of mineral water directly out of my trembling hands. "You clearly have enough money to waste on charity for strangers, while you cannot even afford a decent pair of shoes for a legal meeting of this magnitude," Martha remarked, before deliberately pouring the remaining water onto the floor so that it splashed all over my old leather pumps. I stood frozen in shock at her petty display of malice, while the cold liquid soaked into my socks, making me feel even more humiliated in front of the busy professionals walking past us. "My sister is right about one thing, Joanna, because you really are a magnet for trash. And this broken old man is the perfect companion for a failed seamstress like you," Martha continued with a voice that was dripping with venomous contempt. I started to speak in my own defense, but Edgar suddenly reached out and placed a firm hand on my arm, his calm presence acting like an anchor in the middle of my emotional storm. "A person who measures their worth by the height of their heels and the price of their suit is often standing on a very hollow foundation, wouldn't you agree, young lady?" Edgar asked while looking directly at Martha with a gaze that was remarkably steady and unafraid of her wealth. Martha looked as though she had been slapped by a commoner, her face turning a deep shade of crimson as she realized this beggar actually had the audacity to talk back to her in public. "You should keep your mouth shut and be grateful that I haven't called security to drag you out of this building for being a public nuisance," Martha hissed, while Flynn stepped forward to reinforce her intimidation with his towering physical presence. Edgar merely tilted his head slightly and maintained his terrifyingly calm demeanor, while the tension between us became thick enough to suffocate everyone in the lobby. 9 o'clock in the morning, as the nearby clock tower chimed with a deep resonance that echoed through the canyons of Manhattan. The tension in the lobby reached a breaking point because Martha had completely lost her patience. She paced frantically on the marble floor, while her eyes darted toward the security desk with a predatory intensity that signaled she was ready to initiate a full-scale confrontation. I will not have this prestigious building tainted by the presence of a filthy vagrant who belongs in a shelter rather than a corporate office. Martha screamed as she signaled for the uniformed security guards to approach our corner. Two burly men in dark suits moved quickly toward us, while Martha pointed an accusing finger at Edgar, claiming that he was a professional scammer who had been harassing her for money since she arrived. I immediately stepped forward and positioned my body as a physical shield between the guards and the old man, feeling my heart hammer against my ribs with a mixture of terror and fierce protectiveness. This man is a guest traveling with me, and you have absolutely no legal right to insult the dignity of an elderly citizen who has done nothing but sit here quietly, I declared, with a voice that shook but remained loud enough for everyone in the lobby to hear. The security guards hesitated for a moment when they saw the unwavering conviction in my eyes, but Martha stepped forward and began to berate them for their supposed incompetence in handling a simple trespasser. Do you realize who I am, and how much business my firm brings to this establishment every single year? Martha barked at the head guard while her face distorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated arrogance. I looked at the guard and explained that Edgar was under my care, and that any attempt to forcibly remove him would be met with a formal complaint for harassment and age discrimination. Martha erupted into a fit of mocking laughter at my defense, claiming that my fake saintly personality was exactly why I was destined to leave the upcoming meeting with absolutely nothing to my name. Your pathetic obsession with helping the helpless is a weakness that will ensure you end up just like this old man sleeping on a park bench while I enjoy the fruits of our parents' hard work. Martha sneered with a level of cruelty that made several bystanders turn their heads in shock. While Martha was busy trying to orchestrate an eviction, Flynn stepped closer to me and used his thick stack of legal folders to rhythmically tap against my shoulder in a patronizing and intimidating gesture. He leaned in so close that I could smell the stale coffee on his breath, while he began to whisper a series of terrifying threats regarding the mountain of evidence they had supposedly gathered. Joanna, your sister has meticulously documented every single one of your failures, and we have enough legal paperwork here to ensure a judge took your inheritance within minutes. Flynn warned with a cold shark-like smile that made me feel like I was drowning in a sea of corporate jargon. He claimed that my lack of financial contribution over the last decade would be used as a primary weapon to prove that I was an unfit beneficiary who was merely parasitic in nature. I tried to pull away from his stifling presence, but Martha blocked my path, her eyes gleaming with a sick sense of victory as the security guards began to move in again under her relentless pressure. Throughout this entire chaotic spectacle, Edgar remained in a state of terrifyingly calm silence that felt like the eye of a hurricane amidst the surrounding madness. He did not say a word to defend himself against the accusations of being a beggar, but his sharp, intelligent eyes never left Martha's face as he carefully observed every twitch of greed and every expression of malice. It was as if he was recording her soul onto a permanent ledger, judging the very essence of her character, while she continued to dig her own professional grave with her razor-sharp tongue. Are you quite finished with this embarrassing display of insecurity, or do you require an even larger audience for your spectacular lack of class? Edgar finally asked, with a voice that was so steady and commanding that the security guards immediately stopped in their tracks. Martha opened her mouth to launch another volley of insults, but the sheer weight of Edgar's gaze seemed to paralyze her for a split second, creating a heavy silence that hung over us like a guillotine. I felt a strange shiver run down my spine because I realized that the man I had helped on the street was no longer just a fragile stranger, but a silent witness who was preparing to deliver a verdict that none of us could have ever anticipated. 30 minutes later, the heavy oak doors of the VIP conference room swung open to admit us into a sterile environment that smelled of expensive stationery and a chilling professional coldness. The massive mahogany table in the center of the room seemed to stretch for miles, while the sunlight filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows offered no warmth to the frozen atmosphere. Flynn immediately took his place at the head of the table and began spreading out several documents with a practiced efficiency that made my heart sink into the pits of my stomach. He pulled out a sophisticated copy of a will that featured what looked like an official signature from my parents declaring that Martha was the sole beneficiary of every single piece of real estate and all the family savings. According to this fraudulent document, my years of sacrifice were worth absolutely nothing, and I was to be stripped of my legal rights to the penthouse and the family legacy. Martha leaned back in her leather chair with a triumphant smirk while she slid a separate piece of paper toward me, demanding that I sign a formal waiver of all my inheritance claims. In exchange for my silence and cooperation, she offered me a pitiful sum of $5,000 as a form of charity that felt more like a slap in the face than a gesture of kindness. Sign the paper now, Joanna, and perhaps I will allow you to keep some of your old sewing supplies before the locks are changed on the apartment for good. Martha remarked with a voice that was dripping with arrogant satisfaction. Just as I reached for the pen with trembling fingers and felt the crushing weight of total defeat, Edgar suddenly raised his hand and demanded that everyone in the room stop their proceedings immediately. He reached into the inner pocket of his worn jacket and produced a gleaming high-level legal assistant badge that featured the official seal of the state's highest judicial oversight committee. The entire room fell into a stunned silence as Edgar opened his battered leather briefcase to reveal a pristine original copy of the true will that had been signed and sealed in total secrecy years ago. I suggest you put that forged piece of trash away, Flynn, because I am the sole legal custodian of the only testament that carries the true intent of the deceased, Edgar announced with a voice that had transformed into a thunderous force of undeniable authority. Martha's face turned an ashen shade of gray as she stared at the badge and the documents while the realization began to dawn on her that the man she had mocked was the one person my parents trusted more than their own flesh and blood. She looked like she had seen a ghost, while her hands began to shake so violently that she had to grip the edge of the mahogany table just to remain upright in her seat. The horror on Martha's face intensified when Edgar began to read a specific secret clause in the original will that addressed the exact behavior she had displayed over the past several years. He explained that my father had anticipated her greed and had included a morality provision stating that any heir who engaged in fraudulent activities or the mistreatment of family members would be automatically disqualified from receiving a single cent of the estate. You were so blinded by your own perceived superiority that you forgot that our parents were master observers of human character. Martha, Edgar stated while looking directly into her panicked eyes. He revealed that he had been recording every single insult she had hurled at me in the lobby, and that her attempt to bribe me into silence with $5,000 was now documented proof of her corruption. Martha let out a strangled cry of desperation as she realized that her entire world was collapsing because of a man she had tried to have arrested only an hour ago. This cannot be happening because I was the successful one who was supposed to manage the family fortune while Joanna was just a miserable failure. She shrieked while her voice cracked under the immense pressure of her own undoing. Flynn tried to intervene with a weak legal objection, but Edgar silenced him with a single icy glance that reminded everyone in the room of his decades of experience in the highest echelons of the law. The fraudulent lawyer began to sweat through his expensive silk shirt as he realized that his professional license was now in jeopardy for participating in Martha's elaborate scheme to rob her own sister. Edgar continued to read the final instructions of my father, which named me as the primary executor and the rightful owner of the Manhattan penthouse and the entirety of the family's investment funds. I looked at the old man who had seemed so fragile on the street and realized that he was a giant who had spent his entire life protecting the integrity of the people he served. Martha continued to babble incoherent excuses while her lawyer began to pack his bags in a frantic attempt to distance himself from the disaster he had helped create. The air in the room finally began to feel breathable again as the truth settled into every corner of the office, marking the definitive end of Martha's reign of terror over my life. I realized then that my father's final gift was not just the money or the property, but the presence of a man who could ensure that justice was served with a level of precision that no amount of money could ever buy. 10 o'clock in the morning, the meeting concluded in a haunting silence as the filthy schemes of Martha were finally exposed to the unforgiving light of day. Based on the authentic original will and the irrefutable audio evidence of Martha's verbal abuse in the lobby, the legal transfer of the family home, and all remaining assets to my name was finalized immediately. Martha collapsed onto the polished floor, her designer suit wrinkling, as she sobbed uncontrollably while begging for a forgiveness she had never shown to anyone else. She promised to change her ways and offered to help me manage the estate, but I only looked down at her with a sense of profound disappointment that outweighed any lingering anger. The realization that she was only sorry because she had lost her fortune made it impossible for me to feel even a shred of sympathy for her current predicament. Martha continued to wail about the unfairness of the situation until Edgar sternly reminded her that her own cruelty was the sole architect of her spectacular downfall today. The consequences extended far beyond the loss of the inheritance, because Edgar turned his cold professional gaze toward Flynn and announced his intention to file a formal complaint with the State Bar Association. He detailed the evidence of Flynn's collusion in falsifying legal documents, which would effectively ensure that the lawyer's prestigious career went up in flames before the end of the week. Flynn's face went completely pale as he realized that no amount of corporate connections could save him from the wrath of a legendary legal figure like Mr. Edgar. I stood up and quietly asked Martha to leave the office, declaring that from this moment forward, we no longer shared any familial bond or legal connection. The sisterly love that should have existed between us had died a long time ago, buried under the weight of her insatiable greed and her contempt for the simple life I chose to lead. Martha attempted to grab my hand one last time, but I stepped back and watched as the security guards she had once called upon now escorted her out of the room in total disgrace. I turned to Edgar and expressed my deepest gratitude for his protection, realizing that the kindness I showed a stranger on the street had returned to save my life in the most unexpected way. We walked out of the towering glass building together, and I noticed that the Manhattan sky seemed remarkably clear and blue today, as if the atmosphere itself had been cleansed by the triumph of justice. I knew that my future would be dedicated to honoring the legacy of Mom and Dad by using my new resources to help those who had been overlooked by society. As I watched Edgar disappear into his sleek black sedan, I felt a sense of peace that I had not experienced since before my parents fell ill. The weight of the past was finally gone, replaced by the quiet confidence of a woman who had reclaimed her home and her dignity through nothing more than the power of her own integrity. This story serves as a powerful reminder that genuine kindness is never a waste of time, and those who intentionally trample on others to achieve success will always eventually face a bitter and lonely ending. Real wealth is not found in a bank account or a prestigious title, but in the strength of one's character and the willingness to help a fellow human being during their darkest hour of need. I want to sincerely thank each and every one of you for staying until the very end of my journey. Your support means the world to me. Please take a moment to share your own thoughts or personal experiences regarding betrayal and justice in the comments section below, as I truly value your unique perspectives on this story.